Let's review Pesachim, Daf Details. The new parak of Keter Tzoylin begins telling us how to prepare the Korban Pesach. And the Mishnah tells us to take a spit of wood from a pomegranate tree, put it through the animal, and suspend it over the fire to roast. The intestines and the knees you just put into the body cavity. However, Rabbi Kiva argues and says that would be considered cooking, and the Torah says you must prepare the Korban Pesach tzli eish only. The Mishnah then tells us one shouldn't use a metal spit or metal grill, although the Mishnah relates a story where Rabbi Gamliel instructed Tevi Avdoi to put it on a metal grill. The Gemara tells us the reason why metal is not allowed is because metal conducts heat, and the heat of the metal inside the animal will cook the animal, and that wouldn't be tzli eish. Rabbi Yehuda disagrees and holds that it was allowed. The Gemara then tells us that Rabbi Shmuel used to refer to this method of roasting with the knees and the intestines inside as tuch tuch. And in one Pshat Rashi says it's because the cooking noise that it makes when it's roasting there. Rav Tarfon called it gedi mekulas, a beautiful prepared gedi. The Brisa tells us nowadays we're not allowed to eat gedi mekulas Pesach by night. However, if the entire animal wasn't roasted together, one limb was severed and roasted separately, that would not be gedi mekulas. And the same thing would be if one limb was cooked. Even though it's connected to the rest of the animal that was roasting, that would not be gedi mekulas. The Gemara then discusses mul yaisa. Mul yaisa is when they would use a sharp knife, create a little separation between the meat and the bone, and insert there another type of meat. The question is, are we concerned that the blood will go to that meat and into the main meat of the animal and create an isser? The Gemara tells us that it's not a problem because you say keboiloi kach poeltoi. The same way the meat would have absorbed dam, it's going to also secrete that dam in the flame. The Gemara thought that you could bring a right to that from our Mishnah because we're also cooking the intestines and the knees inside the cavity of the animal. The Gemara says it's not a raya. Since the animal's roasted head down and it's open at the bottom, all the dam runs right out. It never absorbs, so you don't even have to come on to the boil like a poil toy. The Gemara says that's the same thing with a heart. A heart which has it's very hard, it's a hard type of meat. Once again, we say that it doesn't absorb any blood at all, so you don't have to come on to the boil like a poil toy. However, the Gemara relates a story where Rav and Savra prepared for Rav a dish which was a small bird that was wrapped in a dough, and Rav was willing to eat it. So you see, clearly the dough would secrete any dam that it would absorb. Dr. Gemara, the type of dough that was used was very crummy and brittle, and therefore it would never contain any dam. Once again, it would drain right out, so you don't have a raya of kaboy lekach polte. The Gemara tells us another story about Rava who was served by the Reish Galutza this similar type of dish, and he said, I'm going to inspect it carefully, and if there's even the slightest tinge of any redness, I'm not going to eat it. So he seems to say that you don't take a boil lekach polte. The Gemara says that's speaking by a type of flour that was very tough, and it would contain the blood inside it. That's why you have to be overly careful. The Gemara says if it was just a standard type of flour that wasn't brittle and wasn't so tough, then you just see if it's very red, then there's a problem of dam. If not, not to worry. The Gemara then tells us that halacha l'maisa we paskin that mul yasa is mutter even if the opening is on top, which means the blood doesn't just drain out. You still say kaboy lekach polte. The Gemara then tells us that whenever Ravina and Ravacha argue throughout Shas, Ravina is always the one who's mekel, Ravacha is always the one who's machmir. And that's if the Gemara doesn't identify who says what. We assume that Ravina is the mekel, Ravacha is the machmir, and we always pass on the kula like Ravina. There's three exceptions to this rule, and in these three exceptions, it's Ravacha who's mekel, Ravina who's machmir, but once again, we do pass on the kula. And these three cases are if someone has a very bloody piece of meat, or if he has the beitzim of an animal, or if he has the arteries of an animal. These are all things that have a lot of blood in them. Everybody agrees if you roast it, if you slice it open and you roast it, you're for sure allowed to eat it. There's no problem of dam. If you salt it well and then you cook it, you're also allowed to eat this dam. The question is, what if you just put it onto coals? In all these three cases, Ravina is machmer and says it's going to absorb blood. Ravacha is mekel and said the blood will be sucked out by the flame and they'll be mutter, and we pass them like Ravacha. The Gemara then tells us that if one had a very red, bloody piece of meat that he roasted, if it's very red, then the juice that comes out of it is going to be asur al stam. Although there are those who hold it wouldn't be a problem it would just be considered juice, and Rav Ashi himself used to drink that juice. The Gemara then tells us that they used to put tzli into vinegar to suck out its blood. Zok the Gemara, once you use vinegar once, to do that, that vinegar can no longer be used again for another piece of meat. It loses its strength. Even though weak vinegar that was never used will still be effective in sucking the blood out of the piece of meat, once you used it once, it does lose its potency.